Welcome back to the CRUD tutorial section 6. Let's go ahead and set up the backend server, and going to create a new directory. We're going to start from scratch, so we're building the front end and the back end, and then we'll integrate our applications into the framework. So ultimately we'll be doing kind of a regressing back to the beginning. We're going to do initially a build of a package JSON. A package.json here is going to go ahead and start up the initial framework for the dependencies and information we need to get our file running, or our application running. A little bit of details thus far, starting it up. And these are the applications, plugins, or whatever you want to call them, that I'm going to go ahead and install into our back end. Concurrently is going to be something that's going to help run two servers at once. Express obviously is just going to help in our connection with our APIs. JSON Web Token will be passing back and forth to make sure that we have security. And I'm going to go ahead and write a few more things that are going to coincide with the way it concurrently works, and also the ability we're going to be able to put this into Heroku. So I'm going to do a little bit of work here in our script section to prepare it for when it starts up. It needs to do a certain order of things. As you can see here, I'll ask the client, there'll be a server in there as well. Our front-end client will need to be running. So this is the text I'll need to go ahead and put in there to make sure that the client knows to start up its server too. And here's our Heroku information. Later on, we're going to come back in, and we're also going to have to write a proxy that is going to let it work in, while we're with localhost. We'll be running two hosts. Basically, we'll need to connect with localhost 5000. And let's go ahead and build out all the files we're going to need to authenticate this connection. And it's mainly just passing back and forth a token that we save in our storage in our browser. And for the most part, if it gets refreshed or something like that, that's what's important. So these are all the files and folders that are going to be included to get this process working. And we'll just walk through them one by one and fill them in. And once again, this proc file is for if you want to ever put this in Heroku. All right, let's go ahead and start up with requiring Express and everything that comes with it. We're going to be kind of parsing back and forth. Our data is going to be in JSON, so we can get everything prepared for that. We'll be dealing with a MySQL database. We'll be using MySQL 2 here. Once again, some more requirements we're going to need for Node and Express. And this will be our connection to our database. And we'll be doing a local host, which you can obviously switch up and put an IP address in there and change it up wherever you want. It doesn't have to be local. We're going to need the check token function. That we're going to write here in the auth folder token validation file that will be created here in a second. Now this is something that these functions here are going to be required to validate our passwords. So bcrypt is coming into play here, and we'll be utilizing some of its functionality. That means on the server side, no one's going to see, even the web admin couldn't see what your password is. It's encrypted. Once again, these are just a few more functions we're going to need to get everything up and running. Okay. So let's go ahead and get a server to listen. We call Express. We let it know we're using JSON. We want to know what environment we're in. So based on production or not, we want it to do separate things. So if Heroku finds out this is a production environment, it's going to do one thing. There we go. And this is what it'll take to build out the file in production. And when we're going locally, we also have the option of putting a port in here. I chose 5000, which I will have to write into the proxy of the other running server. And then from here, it's going to let us know if it's listening, and it is. Let's walk through the token validation. So we're using a function called verify from JSON Web Token. We need to write a key. A key is something we're going to come up with. It's just a phrase or a word, and that's going to be something that's going to help verify the JSON Web Token based on the encryption. The encryption they use is based on that phrase or whatever you come up with. And as you can see, we're going to be asking for authorization. If we get it, we're going to go through these steps here that they require for JSON Web Token authorization. As you can see, we're using the function verify that we're required to use. Passing through any kind of details. And if we get an error, obviously we want to put out a 0 as opposed to 1, and we don't want to let whoever know what happened. Now, otherwise, we'll be using the function next. And let's say there is no token. We also want to do a 0. And this is clearly just something where someone's unauthorized. Now this is setting up with a database, pretty standard stuff. We have to start out with a table named user. So the connection is going to be here. In this instance, it's going to be on a local host. Now this create pool is something I found that helps keep the connection alive based on the information I pass here. I've noticed a lot of times if you don't do this, you'll have to wake your connection up a lot. And it'll look like it's broken to anybody using it the first time, and then they'll have to log in again and it will work. So this is what I found will help solve that. Now, as you notice, I do everything except for type in the password of the actual database, which is a big problem, and I find out later that I forgot. So yes, password is not here until later in the show. And if it was host, that's where you would change out the IP address of wherever your database lives. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward. All right, the JSON Web Token key. Like I said, it is just some kind of word or phrase you come up with. Based on what you write here, your password will be generated based on that. Now we go ahead and do the user functionality. within this user, you're going to have a password, you're going to have an email, and in this case, we're also going to have a level, whether it's an employee or a manager, something we can alter later. But as you can see, we're using a SQL query, basically. Real standard stuff you can find on the internet. All your basic same commands work here. You're just writing a string, and it sends it in to the database. So like I said, we've got a level, an email, and a password. These are the things you need to create a user. And these are things we'll be expecting back from the, we got a callback here. And here's where we'll actually make the API call, a post. And we need to run through and encrypt our password. And these are the properties need to be passed over and the values. And then from here, we'll call our function create. If there's a server error, we'll go ahead and send out a 500, success 0. And let them know what the error was. And otherwise, we can pass our results. Going to be a status of 200. And whatever JSON we'd like to send, success 1 means that it worked, and a little message would be our results. Now let's do a login function. One thing about logging in is the most important part is this token. We're going to pass it back and forth every time something happens, if the page refreshes, something like that, to verify that this is still a valid token and we can keep our connection live. So, very intricate part of logging in is this needs to be saved on the back end and the front end so they can compare the two. And we'll be storing ours in session storage in the front end. Once again, we're going to pass the string SQL, which is literally what you'd use as a SQL command. And pretty straightforward stuff. You're going to see a lot of patterns that are exactly the same. You're going to fire something off. This is very protocol where it says, is there an error, yes or no? So this is a lot of redundancy. And just like building any kind of CRUD system, it is always the same things, just over and over and over. You get used to it. All right, let's go ahead and build a function called getUserByEmail, and we need to pass the email in there and make our query to the SQL database asking, do you have this email? And if so, let's go ahead and get all the information necessary from that email. And once again, let's walk through the same protocol. There we go. So if it worked out, we send our results. Now, get user by email is outside of the login API call. And the reason I'm doing this is in case we need to call it from somewhere else. In case, like, let's say, hypothetically, I refresh the page, I might want to call that same function. So I keep it independent. Don't lock it into something. This is here. This is the message I get typically if the connection fell asleep. So I don't think you have to write this because I've already covered this in the database connection. However, I still use it just because if the connection was asleep, it'll throw this error, and I know that, it's not broken, it'll just, the connection was asleep. We need to go ahead and try to log in again. This coincidentally will wake it up, so it does kind of solve the problem at the same time. It's just frustrating when the connection goes to sleep, or it just basically stops. I don't think it was asleep. Anyway, so if we don't get the right results, I don't know why it says on abort, but that's supposed to be a 0, which would mean it didn't work. And I'm sure I'll come up here in a minute and fix it. Once again, if you use the exclamation point in front, that means something didn't work out. So result didn't work out in this case. And if it did work out, we need to run through bcrypt and find out if this was something that we can verify is real or not. If they match. Unfortunately, I don't know enough about what bcrypt is doing to tell you. I would recommend going to bcrypt's website and getting to the documents if you really want to know a lot more about encryption. And ultimately, you'll get the documentation that I'm using to get this is written there. They'll probably have a ton more. Like, this is kind of the basics on how to get it working. If you want to know how to do other things, I'm sure they're there too. There's just some stipulations as to when I want this to expire. Everything that they're requiring to make this work. Now here we'll be refreshing the token. And success equals 1. And here's our message. And of course we want to pass that token so that the client side can save it. And one more step to make sure if the token was not valid, or I'm sorry, the email and password weren't valid, and the results were negative, then we have to send this message. Let's go ahead and build the logout function. and this is still on our server.js. We'll be doing a little bit more. Our other tables won't be on this file. We'll build an API folder, and they'll live in there. I tend to keep my user information right on the server file. It's only about 4 functions or something like that, maybe. Now, if somebody logs out, I just basically switch out their token to something that wouldn't match. So that session is now officially over. It doesn't verify the token anymore. It's just one step that I'm doing over on this side. And obviously there's some stuff I need to do on the other side. I'll invalidate whatever user on the client side as well. And so they'd have to log in again. So and there's 1,000 ways to do this. I basically generate an ID, an irrelevant kind of number on the client side, and basically replace the token, which I could do over here as well instead of doing it there. It's whatever you want to do. It's probably better to actually replace it over here so no one sees it going across the internet. And this is letting us know a little bit of detail about did or did not login work, and we'll pass through our new ID to the save token to replace the old one so that the token's not usable anymore. Let's do our delete user. So with delete user, we're just going to pass over the email. And through the user table, we're going to hunt down the email that matches the one we sent over through our parameters. And then we go through the steps required to tell a SQL command to delete that row out of the table. And we can also do an edit. So like I said, we are doing levels here in case somebody is an employee versus a manager. And let's say one of the individuals gets promoted. And so you want to be able to change them from employee to manager or whatever options you have. So this is just going to go ahead and update the level in the user table. And we're not doing parameters, we're actually sending JSON. And we'll be digging down from the JSON and get the level value. And once again, our protocol, if there's an error first. And we're also going to need to get the user level. Now this is going to be, let's say we don't want them to have access to some credit card information, or they can't do edits on sales possibly. So we're going to determine that functionality will be taken back, let's say if they're an employee only. If they're a manager, functionality will be available to them. And it could be just as simple as asking what level this person is, and you do or don't show or build those functionalities within the UI. So it makes it really easy to kind of determine what functionalities you can allow for each individual. And once again, we're going to send our query over, and we'll be doing a get based on the parameters we sent this time. So we'll be sending the email straight up through the API call. Now let's do a basic refresh. And this really, a refresh is just going to validate your token. That's really what happens. And if the token doesn't validate, then the refresh doesn't work, and then the user goes back to the login page. Now I've noticed with this, it works fine as long as I recommend you tell users to use the logout button when their session is over. When they're done, they need to make that part of their process, because if they don't use that logout button and they come and go quite a bit, assuming their session will still be open, it will be a wreck. Like, it will really have problems. So if they don't use the logout button, expect problems. That's what I've told everybody that ever uses the software, right? That if they don't use that, if they don't use their logout, their token will be a mess. And we'll do a change password. So that's a functionality we want to keep for the users. I know a lot of times when I'm setting somebody up, I'll set up their profile, and then they'll be required to change the password once their profile's set up. So this is a must-have. Okay, we determine what body is. We go ahead and start using our bcrypt functionality. We determine what password is. And we say, hey, this is going to be the new password based on whose ever email this is. And we go through our protocol again. Now let's go ahead and build the generic client side. We're in we were already in earlier, the WT login framework tutorial folder. We already have the folders and files we needed there, but we need to create the client React folder. similar to when we built any kind of application in the past, this client folder is going to live in here with our npx. We create npx create React app, and this is where it lives. We're gonna go ahead and make a directory called components, and within components we're going to basically put in all the files we're going to need for the front end. You're going to see a lot of similarities to any of the apps we've written and what we're doing here, because we're going through the same process. We have a folder named components where most of the things are living. App lives outside of that by one level. These are all the things we're going to need for the interface of the login framework. And here they are. As you can see, I've written them all. They're all just blank right now. And we'll go down one by one and fill them in. And I need to back out. Let's go ahead and build the client-side update password function. We're going to need to basically build out each one of these files independently in the component folder. We are going to need to go back into the client and just start installing some of the items we're going to need. Applications kind of from Node Package Manager, like Axios and concurrently. If you're not familiar, Axios is going to be handling the fetch calls. Concurrently handles it so we can have two servers running at the same time for the back and front end. Now we go ahead and import what we need here and create our component and export it. So I'm going to let it know that new password element is a variable that ultimately just represents the field named new password. It's an input field, which I've spelled incorrectly right here. I have to come back around and fix it. But new password is going to represent, if this element exists and we move forward, this is just establishing that there is an element, and we're going to name it new password element. Now, new password originally starts out with nothing. It's just a blank. It's no characters. However, if new password element exists, which it will because it's going to be hard-coded into the HTML, we're going to ask to see if there's a value. And as long as there's a value, then we're going to fire off our call to Axios, or our call to the server side using Axios. I'm just going to do a little bit of back and forth here, looks like. And we're going to need to establish what config means, because we're starting to pass information back and forth to the server side. So whether you do a put, post, get, or delete, we need to authenticate that this is our session and nothing's changed. So by doing that, we send over a variable called config, which got the headers in it. Headers is going to tell you the authentication token they're going to pass and the content type. That's what's going to need to keep this session going. And to actually even make the call and to make this change. And then you're just going to get the token from our session storage and pass it to so they can compare and validate on the server side. And this is going to be something you do every time, part of the process. So as long as new password has characters, that is your new password, and we will put forth the axios.put. Looks like there's a couple of misspellings, like I said, but it'll be back and fix them. Now we're going to pass over our data, which is going to be our email and token. I'm sorry, our email and new password. And on the server side, it'll say where this email matches, we're going to go ahead and swap out password. And you can see on the server side, if you remember, we actually do bring in bcrypt, and it gets encrypted on the server side. But that's already been done. So this is just going to push forth our values and our config so we can validate, and then we'll go through the next process, which is we're going to find out what we got back from the server, if it worked or if it didn't. Now, if it was a success, it'll say 1. So 0 means it didn't work out. And this is the opposite. So if it did work out, then we're good to go. And it did change an update. And of course, if we have an error that they sent back, we need to establish that information for the user. Currently, we're just using it in the console log, but we will bring in our show alert function that we've been utilizing. And we go ahead and put an error. What error is basically a red border around whatever input field has the class applied to it. If you've taken any of the other tutorials, you'll see this is very familiar. In fact, this would be something we've already done in our other front-end tutorials. And so we'll be adding error as a class if, in case there's no characters there and they just have a blank field. Let's just go ahead and write out our HTML. This is going to be really, really simple stuff. Just a couple of things going on here in this component. There's our new password. So whatever gets typed in there is going to be the value of our new password. And then let's go ahead and put in the button to verify that this is what they want to do. There we go. That makes more sense. Let's do the delete on the client side. We've already got one for the back end. And once again, we'll be using Axlios. This is just another function from it, is delete. And right now we'll just actually pass the config, and it'll just be on the page. I'm actually going to bring config over to app eventually, and then I'll pass config down into the components correctly. Because, like, as always, there's no reason to write it twice, so now that it's been written on this page and the change password page, we can't have that. We'll come back around. Now, when I do a delete user, I want to make sure that they're absolutely positive they want to delete. So what I'm going to do initially was that if they say they'd like to delete, it's going to actually just put up a info message box with a yes or a no. And then the yes will actually be the delete button, and no will be something that makes the info box go away. It's kind of the last resort to make sure that there's not a lot of human error deleting people by accident. So as we see, I've got a new misspelling on this page as well. Pass config. We are passing the email and the parameters is what the server side is going to expect. And the response is we want to make sure that the email coming back to us is the same one that we're going to be that's logged in. And if so, then that's going to let us know that we have deleted that user. And now we'll go ahead and put the toggle of the info box. And this button, even though it says it's going to delete user, will just toggle the info box. So if info message equals delete user, this ternary operator is going to show our info box. And here are the two buttons I spoke of. Going to make sure that, are you sure you want to delete this person? And then ask the yes or no. And we can get whoever is logged in. Let's just go ahead and get their name in here so it's a little more personalized from the props. And this delete user as actually lives down here. If the button is clicked in this info box, then we'll actually have the delete user. And if it's no, we're going to set this back to no characters. Info message will be no characters, and so that means that the info box will close. And fix that misspelling. And we'll personalize the message. All right, let's go to the login function. So the login is going to be two sections, two codes of HTML, two blocks of code. One is going to be your basic generic login for a user who's already been created. Now we can toggle that back and forth, and it'll have another option where HTML will provide the ability to create a user. So based on what option is chosen in the login here, they get to do one or the other. And one of these things that comes in handy as you type, we're going to be wanting to compare if they're going to be a new user. We want to make sure that the password field 1 and password field 2 match, because they have to type it in twice. On-handle change means we're going to make an event based on when that input field is being changed. And so if the input field is changed, then that value of that input field will immediately be compared to the other value of the other field, and we can submit an error if they don't match on the fly as they type. And this is the on-handle change you can see kind of coming into fruition here. Now if they match, we would be removing or adding things and classes. And I know everybody's familiar with validate. This is something that I come up with all the time with my front-end stuff. I'm just going to run through from scratch and write a very basic validate so that we can move forward with this. And then when we bring in applications in the future, I'll just be adding on to this validate file, because if you've already taken some of our other courses, we already have a validate file that's specifically used for what we've built. This will be combined with that. And we just want to know very basic stuff. When we run validate, just like always, first we're going to clear out all the error fields, ones that have errors, because we want to check them again. And so the first step is make sure that they're all cleared out so we can check them with a clean slate. So it goes through with select all, find every field that has the error class, and remove the error class. And then at the very least, what we're going to do is when validate is called, it brings in an array of fields. We're going to run through that array of fields, and at the very minimum, we want to make sure that there's at least some character in there. They can't be blank. And if they are blank, we'll add the class error, and then ultimately, whatever function we're trying to fire off, if there's an error in any place on the page, we'll stop that function from working. And here we are going through each field. And we'll be determining what value means. So if they don't have any characters, or if the actual, like on my select ones, I use default a lot of times instead of nothing. If it says default, then that means it's not, it needs to be an error applied to it as well. And if it's the exact opposite and they do have characters in their value, then we'll be removing an error if it exists. So now that we have validate available, let's go ahead and import it. So if this is going to be a new user, or if it's not a new user, all we need to do is validate the email and password field. If it is going to be a new user, and we will be knowing that we will be determining that as we toggle. We're going to need to validate the email password 1 and password 2 fields instead. So based on what they're doing on the page, we will be validating different fields. And I recommend putting things to lowercase because emails in general, you're going to have a really hard time if you don't have them all in lowercase. That could confuse a lot of things. So I recommend doing that. It looks like I need to take that and turn it into a value. But currently, while we're working in this process, we will be saving the password and the email. And here's where we do our comparison. As this movie, or as this film goes on, I come through and do a little bit of fixing to this. As you can see on lines 29, it just says input and then password 1. It doesn't say name equals, so it confuses me a little bit. I just forgot it. So I come through a few times and just kind of toy with this and this comparison. It eventually gets cleaned up. Well, let's just go ahead and write the HTML for these fields. So if we're doing new user equals false, here will just be a standard login of a current already existing user. I mean, I can do a little front end validation if you'd like, just to however many characters is max. Not required, but helpful. And this is going to be the on change. We're going to see the function fire off. And here's where the password field will be. And we'll be passing in the login function from app. It's fairly straightforward for the login. It's just, like I said, 2 fields and a button. And on the other side of the ternary operator is if in case new user is true. And so if that's the case, we're going to be doing a create new account. Password, email is going to be the same kind of field. Here we're going to have a selection of, is this going to be an employee or a manager? You can do whatever levels you want. This is just my example for our tutorial. But the server side will be looking for this, so if you don't send it, you're going to have a problem. Only two options available in my scenario. And we go password 1 and password 2 fields. Now remember, these two have to match before they're submitted, so that it verifies that they are correct. This is what the password that the user wanted. And let's go ahead and get that function available. So coincidentally, this page, it performs kind of two functions. One's login and one's create user. And so since the fields are so small, we're just going to toggle back and forth between the two. There's not a huge amount of difference. And we'll have the create user function brought in from app, which we'll create here shortly. But these are the two functions. They don't live on this page. They will be utilized on app and just brought in. Now also we want to have the little link that says new or not user, and if based on whatever they click here, this toggles the entire page. So if they don't have an account, they'll click this and it'll switch. Let's set new user to true, and then down here it's going to say the opposite. I'll come back and fix it. That's what it will say. Now main contents right now is just going to be a placeholder for us. I just need to have something. Eventually I'm going to be taking the main content file out, and we'll be plugging in our components and our web apps that live in this login framework. I just want to do a little bit of spacing. And this is just going to let the user know that this is where your apps will go when we're ready. And you're probably familiar with the way I'm putting my navs together. I'm going to build it again. We can walk through pretty standard stuff about the nav. And when you get new components and new applications, our new web apps are plugged in here, we'll be using the nav just like we always do, going in with the line item that goes horizontal and adding a new link and an updating active module, just like everything else. We'll walk through it. Now we want to remember to have mobile nav available if somebody has mobile nav, and I get that determined by the size of the screen. And if the screen's smaller than, I think, 768, then I determine that it is now a mobile screen. And so I invoke all these different rules for the mobile menu nav. And if you remember from any of the other tutorials, we're not using the regular routing. We're using something I've created. It's just being passed around called active module. That being the case, the nav will tell what active module is selected, and then we show the components affiliated with that active module. We're not traditionally going page to page. We're having different components show up based on what active module is active. So it's not as straightforward as just going to a different page. Let's go ahead and write the HTML. We all remember the fixed nav at the top with the little hamburger menu to expand the mobile nav. And this is documentation that can be easily found on the Bootstrap. If you want to look at it in the examples, they'll have a fixed nav example, a fixed footer example as well. Now the nav typically, in this situation, you won't even see the nav until we have a valid user. So otherwise, you're just going to see the login. And here we go with me constructing the button for mobile nav. And here is the hamburger button. Okay, so now we're going to go in and start actually putting the menu items together. And based on all of the things that Bootstrap has done in its CSS, this works fine. I'm not using any of Bootstrap's built-in JavaScript. I'm not. I'm just using their CSS, and then I toggle what I want to see based on my JavaScript. I don't want to import all of their stuff. I don't need it. I just need to toggle a couple things, so no reason to bring in so much. As you can see, I'm using animated, which is something that you should be familiar with my other courses. It's just CSS animations. Looks like I spelled it wrong here, but it will come into play here in a little bit. I'll be importing animate. Here is our line items for our horizontal menu. It's horizontal on desktop, and it's coincidentally it'll be vertical for mobile. And main content is really our only option currently. Like I said, later on we'll be plugging in other applications, and this will grow. So main content will be the only one able to be active. Okay, let's go ahead and build the app in the client folder. This is going to be the hub for all of our applications. So a lot of the user functionality is going to be here on the app, and then it will dictate down to the modules. Let's say hypothetically whoever the user is, things like that. Now we're going to need Axios, obviously, because it's going to have a lot of connections to an API here. And everything that we wrote in those files, the change password, delete user, all those things, they're going to be brought in here to our app. This is the framework for our login. For the most part, this is the client-side heart of that. And main content, like I said, it's just going to be a placeholder until we get some web apps plugged in here. All right. Now this is something you don't have to do. I typically, when someone logs out, I generate like a string of characters. This is a function. There's a lot of ways you can do a random character. This one's really powerful. Someone gave it to me. I did not write it. But it can generate a really good UUID, and it can be helpful in many ways. And I tend to use that. I replace my web token when someone logs out with just a random string of characters. on the server side so that they can't use that token again. And like I said, you can do that on the server side if you want. And this is one of the more important values that we pass around to almost all of the components. The user email once logged in. Is valid user is going to be very important. If it's not a valid user, we will be displaying the login components. If it is a valid user, we'll be showing the login framework with the apps available in the nav bar, so on and so forth. And we'll do a default of main content being the first active module, since it's our only module, our only option thus far in the nav. And if you're familiar with the show alert concept, this is something I utilize in all my web apps currently, where I can pass them a message and then the alert box will have a certain color based on the Bootstrap's color-coded number or name. So success is green and so on and so forth. Danger will be red. I think info and secondary are more like kind of a gray or something, but that's what we're following here. So the alert type is going to determine the color, and the alert itself will be the message we pass. And here's going to be a few things we're going to toggle back and forth with. And I'm pretty sure we're familiar with these info messages that I've been creating. It's kind of the catch-all before someone makes a decision. Are you sure you want to do this? Are you sure you want to do that? Now I'm going to bring over, from change password, I'm going to bring over the config. I'll put it in app so I can pass it around. And it will just live up here, and when anybody wants config, I just would pass it from here. Now here's our show alert function where we tie in alert type and alert. This is going to be utilized all the time. When we're doing calls with Axios, if something is successful, they get a message. If it's not successful, they get another message. So show alert is going to be utilized constantly. Anytime somebody does anything, for the most part, it's going to show up. Everybody wants that warm fuzzy to know, did this not work? And this is our ability to convey that. Now, we're only going to have that message show up for about 3 seconds, and then it's going to go away. The message also has an animation, so we'll be utilizing a fade down in and a fade up out in the animations. Okay, so let's go ahead and get the HTML in here. Alert is going to be something that lives on its own. That's why we're doing a React fragment here, is because I think alert is something that will be floating on its own, kind of similar to the nav. It's fixed at the top. I don't want to contain my alert within the container of the body. So we'll ultimately start it up here first. And it will swing down once it's called. And as you can see, here is our animated we're calling, and we'll have to bring that in because we haven't yet. Not in this case, perhaps. Might as well take the bracket, yeah, get that bracket out of there. All right, let's go ahead and bring in the animate, and we'll bring in font awesome. Basically, these are things that you just connect to. So as you can see from our last project in the HTML, here's our animate. This is just a library. It's called Animate CSS, and you can find it and find the documentation online. Here's their animate library. I'm just going to add it. Not a big deal. I'm going to bring it into the index.js, and it's all predetermined. So it has timing all laid out. It has basically classes that I already know and I can call when I'm ready, and it already has them built. So all this animation can be brought in without me spending too much time. And then from here on the public index, in the public folder in index.html, I've put boot swatch, I put the slate theme, and I put all my font awesome links here on the index.html within the public. So when it builds, it will have font awesome, and it will have my animate information there too. I'm sorry, it will have my bootstrap information there too. Okay, so let's determine what gets shown when. If we don't have a valid user, then we only show the login component. If we do have a valid user and they have logged in, then we determine which active module has been selected, or in this case, main content is the only one, so it's selected by default. This is exactly where we put in our components later on, our web app components. So based on their login, they can either see our components or they see a login based on valid user. And this can get rather large. So within this container, we can see a lot. Let's go ahead and get the nav put in here as well, because you won't see that unless you're logged in. This turning our operator true and false, so it is valid user. It does a lot of information. Let's pass down. It does a lot of determination as to where we are. Let's pass the active module function and value to the nav so it knows what we're doing. Let's pass our user email. And let's go ahead and do a little more deep exploration into how we validate a user. Now, validate's going to be used a lot of times. If someone logs in, that would be called. If someone refreshes their page, this is going to be kind of one of those things where we need to call it. So it determines if this session is ongoing and if it determines if it's not. So as you can see, usually when we have a 0 or 1, 1 equaling success, these are the items that get passed down. So if we find that the validate user is 1 after our login, which gets sent back from the server side, then we're going to push all these things. We're going to make sure the token gets saved again. We're going to make sure that the user is valid to switch to true. We're going to check everything to make sure that this is what we want. And we'll set user email to whatever we pass down. If this doesn't work out, and this is not a valid user, like let's say somebody hit logout and then the success was 0, then we switch all this stuff. And we clear it all out, and we have the ability for the user to just see the login component. I'm not sure if that's necessary, but let's go ahead and do our create user. Now I keep validate user out because it gets called a lot. That's why it's not embedded into its own another function. It gets called a lot, so I need to keep it separate. All right, we'll go ahead and determine all of our variables here, and then we will be sending out a post. And in this case, we're just sending out the headers of content type, along with the data of email, password, and level. And based on our response from the server side, we can do a few different things. If it's not 0, then that means that it worked. Okay. And we'll be passing down the new user and set new user to the login from app. Now, if it didn't work, that means that data.success, res data.success equals 0. So we'll just pass along the message that was delivered in our new show alert function. And of course, if there was a server error outright, then we'll pass that along with another show alert. Now let's just do the login function. So we'll start from scratch. We'll go ahead and set the email to nobody right now, and then we'll build it out to find out what email is in the email input field. Make sure that it's lowercase, as always. And we'll push through the validate. And as you can see, I'm going to put up an array to the validate function. It's going to go through that array and validate each field. So in this case, the email or password field will be validated. If the validate function finds that there's no characters in these fields, then it's going to fire off and apply the error class. That being the case, if there is an error, I will show an alert, and then I'll return false, which stops everything. So we will not move forward with the login process if there is an error. On the other side, if there is no error, we shall move forward with the login and use Axios to post. Well, let's go ahead and send our data, email, password, and from there we also want to make sure that we get our headers across so our content type is established. Okay, now our standard response and error informations for our callback we've been waiting on. So if we end up finding out that success does not equal 0, then we know that this person logged in. And we can validate the user with that function that we want to call. We let it know, spell success correctly, all the details that it expects. And if it doesn't work out, and they didn't log in, then we just show them otherwise with the response, basically the message. And I'll come through here and clean this up. Now, if there's an error, we also want to show that was a server error. And we can fire off that information as well. And we also need to have a logout function installed. Now, if someone's logging out, we already know all the details. The isValid user is going to be false. We've got to clear out the email. We're going to clear out all passwords. We're going to clear out all tokens. Like, they're logging out. So we can set validate user to false and get them back to the login page, the login component, mind you. And it's really easy to just log somebody out like this. And then obviously we want to contact the server, and we're going to go ahead and switch out their token to something that's not valid. So what I do is I basically do a put, and I send them out. Not only I just verify the email, but then I change the token that they're logged in under to have like a random UUID that just doesn't match anything. And that will be determined. That'll determine that they're not logged. That their session's over. And go through our standard protocol of every Axios call we ever make. They're all the same. You'll get used to being routine here. All right. So once we're done with the explanation as to why something didn't work out, let's go ahead and start the refresh option. Now, refresh is an interesting one. We're just refreshing the page, so we need to remember like what the active module was, where we were last. So that's going to be stored in session storage. So we need to grab that first, and then we can apply it. And if it exists in local storage, then we just apply it to active module. And we want to go ahead and see what the token that we saved is, and we're going to compare it. Let's go ahead and run with this axial call. So we pass on the email, we pass on config, and so they can validate whether we are actually supposed to be having a session or not. And what we do here is a try catch. So if my session storage has a token and that token equals the response res data token from the server, then we're going to run the validate user function with the success of 1, just like we did at any other time. If that token does not equal what was sent back to us during the refresh, then we can basically stop this altogether. There we go, and we'll let them know, hey, this didn't work out, and we can just log them out from there. So let's build the footer. The footer is not the most important part of this app, but it is necessary for our settings. So if you want to change something, for instance, if you want to change your password, or you want to delete the user, or log out, these options are all going to be user functionality located in your footer. Settings is what probably the best way to call it. Anything you need to do with user functionality. Now just build out the HTML. There's 3 sections for the most part. I'm just dividing the footer up into 3. And if you look, there are some options on footers if you want to go to Bootstrap's documentation and take a look and see how they're built and how to fix them to the bottom, so on and so forth. But I am going to do a toggle of info message. And so when someone clicks on my email name with a little cog gear next to it, we're going to expand the account settings and so that they can access the delete and use a password update option. You'll see here in a minute it'll just be a toggle. But this will be the button that toggles, or the link. And here we are. We're going to set info message back to nothing if they want to close out the account settings. And here's the information for the account settings. Here we go, with a component change password is going to be right here. We need to pass show alert down. So if it fails or successes, we need to show that. The config needs to be passed down as well, because these have to these are authentic connections, so we have to verify that. Delete user, obviously we need to pass down a few things as well. Logout's going to be a function, it's going to need to know. User email, obviously, and show alert. These are all things that are very common to be passed down to each one of these components. Info message is going to be another function, or another value we're going to send over there. And let's go ahead and make our logout button here too. Looks like a little bit of missing a bracket somewhere, or need to add one. Yeah. All right, let's start this thing up and see where our errors are. Okay, so like I said earlier, this is in our client folder, this is our package.json. I need to make sure that concurrent is going to be knowing that to run 2 servers. So proxy localhost 5000 tells me that the non-production version we're going to have a server is going to be running at the localhost of 5000. And that way it knows to run 2 servers at the same time, and they're going to need to communicate. So this is the last step in the concurrently option that we installed earlier. Now there is also something with React 18. It's a fix, not a big deal, but I had to do it. They have a polyfill fix that needs to be installed. So as you just follow me through this process, and I'll write the documentation of where I got this down. But you're going to have a lot of hard times if you're using polyfill with Node with React 18. You're going to have some kind of a fix. Not a big deal. It's already been built out. I just need to plug it in. And I didn't write this function. This is something someone else has written. And we got to make sure the Webpack, that needs to be in the correct spot. It can't be in the client. It needs to be out. And then we're going to have to let it know. Well, it's in the client, but it needs to be in the same file level as the package.json. And we're also going to need to tell the package.json, once you start, we need you to go here and run this function, so that Webpack will configure our polyfill. And it looks like we need to also bring in validate for the App.js. New password needs to be spelled correctly. There we go. And new user has to have the props in front of it because it's passed in from app. Looks like we got a bracket issue here. Let's go ahead and fix that. Okay, let's try to log in. To create new account. That is toggling correctly. Now is it? Let's try it again. That's what it is. It needs to be that one of them needs to be false. So it's not creating a new account. It's already have a login. So this will be false. Now you'll see it work correctly. There we go. So we can toggle back and forth from new account to login. So let's go and pass some functions. Let's go ahead and make sure they have everything they need. Login, obviously, the application App.js has it, so we need to pass that down to the functionality and login component. This needs to be exported correctly, so validate needs to be polished off here. Just fixing up a couple of errors. 0 would be what we want, not on abort. So the login is going to respond correctly with a 0 if it didn't work. So let's just see if it works. That'd be a no. We've got a 500 error. Error can refuse from login. We've got to figure out why. There needs to be an S on the end of results. That's important. These little small details. Okay, so now it says login, and the password wouldn't. It's mixed up. It didn't like my password. Let's go ahead and go back in and let's take a look at our database. Now I need to make, and if you remember, I need to make a username tutorials because that's what my user is within the actual application. So it's telling you I want to use this user, and it's like that user doesn't exist. So let's go ahead and let's take a look at what we got here. We got these users. And these are all of our information. So if you look, we've got email, password, token, and level. And they all have a required amount of characters in their string. Email being the unique key. Let's go ahead and keep up with our small fixes here, and we're almost finished. Create user needs to be passed down to login so that we can use it. We can click the button and it'll know what to do. It needs to be spelled correctly with an E. Yep, everywhere. Try it again. That needs to be value. It must have just written it automatically. That would make sense. So we need to make sure it's the value. And then this has to have a name of new user for create user. And these all need to be in the correct order. Like, that's really important. You're definitely going to want to get rid of that extra comma. At this point, you can actually write things a couple different ways. I think what I'm doing here is just trying to trial and error my way through a couple of errors. So bear with me here while I fix these problems. And obviously name needs to be assigned. So input password 1 on line 28 won't work. So we'll definitely be back here. Once again, I'm just doing some trial and errors to see where It hasn't occurred to me where my errors are just yet. It will. You don't have to write it like this, not in the newer JavaScript. So 500 error using password. Let's go back. And this is it. I need to add password to my MySQL connection. Interesting. So that was that important. Since I didn't have password here, that connection did not work. Let's start it fresh. Create a new user. Looks like I have a simple syntax error. That's really easy to fix. There we go. Too many commas. All right, let's try this one more time. Success equals 1. Res.data data doesn't mean anything, so I think it's message. Okay, I'm officially logged in now. You can see we're missing a few things though. I need to have the word logout within the button. And it's going to do a little cleanup with our CSS. We don't need any of this demo CSS anymore, so let's get rid of that. This is just pasted in from a footer that I got from Bootstrap. The documentation has a footer positioned and fixed at the bottom. And all these things I need to go ahead and kind of clean up. So let's go ahead and try this again. I'm logged in correctly, and I can log out correctly. Let's go ahead and test it all. Now, here I've found my problem and have to have name equals password 1, because otherwise that doesn't mean anything. And the DB needs to be there instead of DD. So see, these are all little typos that happen. So logged in correctly. Let's watch the network. It says it's logging out kind of, but not the way it needs to. Let's go ahead and test the logout correctly. Now we don't want to save the token just yet. I don't know why that was a thing. Logging out's working. Let's change the password and test it. I'm going to log in. Here's in our settings now. I'm going to do inspection, change password. Got to spell that right. It can't have the N on the input, or I'm sorry, the I on the input. Try it again. Logged in. Change password to this. Network says 1 row affected. That means it worked. going to change it. Now we've changed it back. It's correct. It is working. We are affecting one row, so that's good. And we change it to what we had it again. Now it's changed password is now working. Now let's test delete user. Right now, delete user is just kind of there. It's not. There's not a whole lot to it. So let's pass it along. And if there's an error, we'll convey that. And once again, our show alert comes in handy, whether it's a good or bad success. Okay. So if we want to delete a user, it asks, are you sure? It says it was denied, success was 0. So let's go find out what happened. It looks like we're getting closer. Authorized user is denied. You need to pass config down to delete user. Otherwise, it won't be authorized. That's our problem. Here we are. All right. So what we will need to do here is also perform a logout, just to add the logout to this. And we'll be passing validate user down. So validate user is a props now. It's being brought into delete user. We're going to pass through the success 0, logged out, no email, and just pass a message out too. So that we'll go back to the login page. And as you can see, I've got a couple users here. Let's go ahead and delete one of them and see if it works. And let's check it out. Delete user Hank. Yep. And we got back to the login. So that's it. Hank is now gone. See, he's out of our database. And you can't log in. There we go. So our login's working, delete user's working, change password's working. And we want to make sure these are session storage because that's where they've been stored the whole time. So when you log out, we'll just get rid of the email and token. And let's go ahead and do a logout. And when I hit logout, they're gone. There you go. One more fix we need to do. This token needs to have a 0 in front of it with double brackets. Otherwise, it'll come up as undefined when we refresh the page, and we won't be able to refresh. So just a quick fix.